The lights had barely dimmed before the roar of the crowd rose like a tidal wave, sweeping across the arena in a violent celebration of a legend. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, stepped onto the stage once more, his body trembling, eyes distant, breath shallow. Fans saw what they wanted to see, a resilient icon giving one last show. But behind that familiar snarl was a man in pain. A man who, according to acclaimed actor Robert Duvall, had been quietly begging for mercy long before the final curtain ever dropped. Duvall, now in his 90s and known for his storied film career and no-nonsense candor, never seemed like the type to involve himself in rock and roll drama. Yet when he sat down for a quiet conversation in what he thought was a casual moment, the floodgates opened. His voice cracked, his hand trembled, and for the first time, he revealed something he says he's carried for years, a truth so dark, so damning, it would shake the very foundation of the Osbourne empire. She forced him to tour, he said plainly, voice low, when he could barely walk. Just for the money. I saw it with my own eyes. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. She he refers to as Sharon Osbourne, Ozzy's wife, manager, and public protector for decades. But if Duvall is to be believed, she was also his greatest tormentor in private. Not with fists, but with expectations, with contracts, with obligations to perform long after his body had crumbled under the weight of Parkinson's disease, spinal surgeries, and years of physical decay. To Duvall, what he witnessed wasn't love, it was business. Ruthless, calculated business. And it may have cost Ozzy everything. The world saw the glamorous chaos of the Osbournes rise. Reality TV stardom, sold-out world tours, platinum records, and a household name built from rebellion. But Duvall's claims suggest another layer entirely. One in which Ozzy Osbourne, the man behind the myth, was slowly drained of his vitality, dignity, and will. He paints a picture not of rock and roll glory, but of quiet suffering, backroom deals, and forced smiles under crushing pain. I remember the last time I saw him, Duvall said, eyes clouding as he spoke. He shuffled in like a ghost, barely recognized me. And when we were alone, he whispered, I can't do this anymore, Bob. She won't let me stop. That moment, according to Duvall, broke something inside him. For years he said nothing, afraid of the backlash, the media storm, and the wrath of an empire built on silence. But now, with Ozzy gone, or at least erased from the public spotlight entirely, Duvall says the world deserves to hear the truth. The story that unfolds from that single sentence is one of stardom weaponized, love turned into leverage, and a man who, despite having millions chanting his name, felt utterly powerless behind the scenes. According to Duvall, Ozzy's final years were not a victory lap, but a hostage crisis. Not a farewell tour, but a slow, agonizing march to the end orchestrated by someone who claimed to love him most. This revelation didn't erupt from a press conference. It came out quietly, during an off-camera conversation that was later confirmed by multiple sources who witnessed the breakdown firsthand. What followed was an avalanche of emotion, guilt, and frustration that Duvall says he couldn't hold back any longer. I was complicit by staying silent, he admitted. But I'm not taking this to my grave. What does it mean when love turns into a contract? When marriage becomes management? When the person sworn to protect you is the one urging you to keep dancing on broken legs? These are the questions that sit at the center of this story, and they aren't questions with simple answers. Because, on paper, Sharon Osbourne was Ozzy's savior. She rescued his career, stabilized his public image, and built him into a brand that stretched beyond music. She stood by him through addiction, scandals, and moments of public disgrace. But Duvall challenges the entire narrative, suggesting that Sharon's devotion was as much about power as it was about love, and that when Ozzy became inconvenient, when his frailty risked tarnishing the brand, she didn't let go. She pushed harder. Ozzy, whose voice once shook arenas, was now shaking simply from standing. He'd become a shadow of himself, hunched over, eyes watery from medication, and needing assistance to walk. And yet, tour dates kept piling up. Album releases continued. Appearances were booked and photo ops scheduled. Every time he looked like he might retreat into retirement, someone pulled him back. If Duvall's story is true, then what we witnessed in Ozzy's final public years wasn't resilience. It was exploitation dressed in rock and roll makeup. And those cheering crowds, those thousands of fans screaming his name, may have unknowingly applauded a man breaking apart in real time. We live in an age where celebrity narratives are curated to perfection. Every Instagram post, every red carpet appearance, every concert is part of a story, one carefully crafted by PR teams and managers to maintain the illusion. But sometimes, those illusions become prisons. And sometimes, behind the glitz, there's someone quietly begging for it to end. Robert Duvall, now well into his twilight years, is a man without much left to lose. That makes his confession all the more powerful. It's not a bid for attention. It's not a scandal for profit. It's the voice of a friend who says he waited too long to speak. And now he wants the world to understand what really happened to one of music's most iconic figures. This expose is not just about pointing fingers. It's about examining how the machinery of fame can consume even those who seem untouchable. How love and loyalty can be weaponized. How contracts and reputations can sometimes mean more than human life. Over the next chapters, we will delve deeper into the heart-wrenching details of Duvall's testimony, uncovering shocking events that were hidden in plain sight. You will hear stories that may change the way you remember Ozzy Osbourne. You'll see how a global tour was allegedly fueled not by passion, but by pressure. How a man with failing health was treated more like a commodity than a husband or father. And how the silence of those around him, including some of Hollywood's most powerful names, allowed it to continue unchecked. What drove Sharon Osbourne to keep pushing when Ozzy himself wanted to stop? What did Robert Duvall witness that made him break his silence now? And more importantly, why didn't anyone else speak up? By the end of this story, you'll be forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. That even legends aren't immune to being used, and that sometimes, the person holding you up is also the one pulling your strings. Stay with us, because what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the price of fame. Before there was controversy, before the reality shows, before the lawsuits and the leaks, there was just the music. The world met Ozzy Osbourne as the unfiltered frontman of Black Sabbath, a voice that seemed to rise straight from the underworld, spitting rage and rebellion across the faces of the establishment. He wasn't polished. He wasn't controlled. He was raw, dangerous, and unapologetically unpredictable. And that's exactly why millions worshipped him. Ozzy's early years were chaos embodied. Born in Birmingham, England, into a working-class family, he was the kind of kid teachers warned other kids about. Arrested for petty theft, plagued by poverty, and haunted by undiagnosed mental health issues, he never seemed destined for greatness. Yet when he found music, everything changed. His voice became a weapon, his erratic nature a form of performance art. What the world saw as madness, he repurposed into magic. But even back then, it was clear, Ozzy needed someone to protect him from himself. Drugs consumed him. Alcohol became his compass. He stumbled through fame like a blindfolded man in a minefield. And just as he was about to implode, kicked out of Black Sabbath, broke, and spiraling, someone stepped in. That someone was Sharon. Sharon Osbourne wasn't just another woman in his life. She was the daughter of Don Arden, one of the most feared and respected music managers in the UK. Ruthless, shrewd, and deeply entrenched in the business, Don was a man who knew how to bend the industry to his will. And Sharon inherited every bit of his cunning. When she met Ozzy, he was broken. But she didn't see a failure. She saw potential. She saw a brand. The story goes that she took him under her wing, helped him get clean, and rebuilt his career from the ground up. And to her credit, she did. With Sharon managing his every move, Ozzy released The Blizzard of Oz, which became one of the most influential metal albums of all time. From there, his solo career exploded. Tours sold out. Albums flew off shelves. The Prince of Darkness was reborn, not as a lost soul, but as a global phenomenon. And it was all because of Sharon. They married. They raised a family. And soon, the Osbourne name wasn't just associated with metal. It became synonymous with entertainment itself. MTV's The Osbournes turned them into a reality TV dynasty, with millions tuning in weekly to watch their chaotic, expletive-laced lives unfold. It was one of the first shows to blend celebrity with unfiltered domesticity, and it set the stage for a new era of fame. Suddenly, Ozzy wasn't just a rock god. He was a household name. At the center of it all was Sharon. Fiercely protective, unrelentingly business savvy, and unapologetically brash, she handled the empire like a general at war. She booked the tours. She negotiated the contracts. She managed the brand. But more than anything, she controlled the narrative. Ozzy was the face, but Sharon was the architect. They were untouchable. The metal world adored Ozzy. The entertainment world admired Sharon. Together, they built a legacy that transcended music. They launched Ozfest, mentored rising artists, and became frequent guests on talk shows. For decades, they seemed like the perfect fusion of chaos and control, a balance of wild talent and strategic management. But that harmony, according to Robert Duvall, was an illusion, one that came at a devastating cost. To understand the tragedy of Ozzy's final years, you have to understand the mechanics of the empire. At its core, the Osbourne brand was built on motion. Tours, appearances, television, endorsements, everything was designed to keep the machine moving. Every pause threatened momentum. Every cancellation risked money, relevance, and visibility. And that's where the trouble began. As Ozzy aged, the signs of deterioration became impossible to ignore. His hands began to tremble. His speech slowed. His body, once an unpredictable instrument of madness, started to betray him. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's, underwent multiple surgeries, and publicly acknowledged his health battles. And yet, despite the diagnoses, despite the pain, he continued to perform. To the public, it looked like courage. A man refusing to let his ailments define him. An artist determined to keep giving his fans everything he had. But to those close to him, including Robert Duvall, it looked like something else entirely: exploitation. An aging icon being pushed to his physical limits to satisfy contracts, maintain branding, and preserve an empire that had grown far too big to slow down. What happens when your body breaks, but your name still sells? What do you do when the world expects you to scream, but you can barely speak? Ozzy Osbourne was not just a man, he was a commodity. And according to Duvall, that commodity was being squeezed dry, right up until the end. The people around Ozzy, his crew, his doctors, his team, were allegedly aware of his condition. But no one, Duvall claims, had the authority or courage to say no to Sharon. She was the gatekeeper, the protector of the brand. And she had made a decision: Ozzy would keep moving, whether he wanted to or not. It's easy to paint Sharon as the villain in this narrative, but the truth may be far more complex. There's no denying the role she played in Ozzy's success. She saved him from the brink. She built him back up. And in doing so, she also built herself. Perhaps she believed that pushing him was helping him, that keeping him on stage was preserving his spirit. But at some point, Duvall suggests, that belief became delusion. And that delusion became cruelty. He recalls one evening, long after the cameras had stopped rolling, when he visited the Osbournes at their home. Ozzy was quiet, sunken into a chair, his movements slow and pained. Sharon, ever the hostess, greeted Duvall with warmth and energy. But when she left the room, Duvall leaned into Ozzy and asked how he was holding up. Ozzy looked up, eyes misted, and whispered, "I don't know who I am when I'm not performing. But I can't keep doing this, Bob. My legs don't work. My mind's fading. And she won't let me rest." Those words haunted Duvall. They didn't sound like the lament of a tired artist. They sounded like a prisoner's confession. And it was in that moment, he says, that the illusion shattered. This wasn't about music anymore. It was about survival. The empire that Ozzy and Sharon built was beautiful, powerful, and groundbreaking. But behind the polished interviews and curated appearances, Duvall believes, was a rot that no one wanted to see. And when a man's body is breaking, but the machine keeps turning, someone has to be responsible. In this chapter, we've seen the rise, the glamour, the unbreakable partnership that reshaped rock history. But from here, the story begins to change. The glitter starts to fade, and the real tragedy starts to show. Ozzy Osbourne gave the world decades of music, madness, and magic. But as his body began to give out, the question loomed larger with each performance. Was he choosing to keep going? Or was he being pushed past the point of no return? Robert Duvall says he knows the answer. And in the next chapter, we'll explore the private moments, the whispers, the pleas, the things fans never saw, that revealed just how desperate Ozzy had become to stop. and how those cries for help were allegedly met not with compassion, but with contracts. It was easy to look at Ozzy Osbourne on stage and think he was immortal, a living legend defying age and illness, still howling into the microphone with that unmistakable growl, moving across the stage, sometimes slowly, sometimes with a strange jolt of energy that reminded fans of his youth. But behind the music, behind the carefully timed pyrotechnics and roaring fans, there was a quieter, more painful story unfolding. A story that Robert Duvall says few knew about, and even fewer dared to confront. When the cameras turned off and the crowds faded, Ozzy was not the same man. According to Duvall, who maintained a decades-long friendship with the singer through their shared time in the entertainment industry, Ozzy would often retreat into long silences. He wasn't brooding, Duvall recalled. He was exhausted, bone deep. You'd talk to him one day, and he'd be fine. The next, he'd look at you with those haunted eyes, like he was trying to remember who he was before all of this. What changed? According to Duvall, it wasn't just age or illness, it was a sense of entrapment. As the years passed and his health declined, Ozzy increasingly found himself locked into cycles of commitments that no longer made sense for a man in his condition. Physically, he was deteriorating. Spiritually, he was drained. Yet every year brought more tour dates, more appearances, more obligations. In private conversations that Duvall now regrets not recording, Ozzy allegedly confided feelings of despair. He would say things like, "I don't know if I'll make it to the next show," or "Every time I walk on that stage, I feel like I'm dying a little more." These weren't poetic musings from an aging rocker. These were urgent cries from a man who felt trapped inside a system he no longer controlled. Duvall recalls one particularly telling moment. They were at a private dinner in Malibu, just a small gathering with close friends. The atmosphere was casual, even light. But as the evening wore on and the guests dwindled, Ozzy pulled Duvall aside and asked if they could talk privately. They went out onto the patio overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the water. Ozzy lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. He took a long drag, then looked at Duvall with hollow eyes. "She doesn't listen anymore," Ozzy said. "I tell her I'm in pain, that I can't keep doing this. But it's like talking to a wall. Everything's about the next show, the next deal. I'm tired, Bob. I'm so tired." Those words, Duvall says, have echoed in his mind ever since. This wasn't the defiant rock star the world knew. This wasn't the manic, bat-biting icon. This was a man facing the limits of his body and mind, whispering for help into a void he felt powerless to escape. And perhaps most tragically of all, according to Duvall, those whispers were being ignored by the one person who could have stopped it all. The pain wasn't just physical. Yes, there were days when Ozzy could barely get out of bed. There were moments where his tremors were so severe he could hardly hold a fork. But more than that, Duvall describes a psychological burden that seemed to be crushing him. A constant pressure to perform, to deliver, to maintain the persona of Ozzy Osbourne even as the man behind it faded. He was afraid, Duvall said. Not of death. He made peace with that a long time ago. He was afraid of disappointing people. Afraid that if he stopped, everything would fall apart. And she knew that. She used that. Robert is careful when he speaks about Sharon. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't sling accusations like a tabloid. Instead, his tone is one of quiet heartbreak. She loved him, I believe that, in her own way. But love can get twisted when money and legacy get involved. I think somewhere along the line, she stopped hearing him. Or maybe she didn't want to. One of the most jarring revelations Duvall shared involved an incident after one of Ozzy's shows in Europe. The performance had been rough. Ozzy stumbled on stage, missed lyrics, and at one point had to be helped off for a brief moment before returning. Fans chalked it up to exhaustion or a bad night. But what they didn't see was what happened backstage. Ozzy reportedly collapsed after the show, his body trembling uncontrollably, his breathing ragged. Medical staff were brought in. There were hushed conversations. And yet, within 48 hours, he was on a flight to the next tour stop. When Duvall asked why he wasn't resting, Ozzy's answer was chilling. "She says the contract's airtight. We lose money if I back out." Duvall tried to intervene, to talk Sharon into postponing the tour. He says he was met with a cold smile and a wave of the hand. "He wants to do this," she told him. "This is who he is." But Duvall saw something else entirely. He saw a man cornered, guilt-tripped into compliance. A man afraid not only of losing fans, but of losing the only identity he'd ever known. As time went on, these confessions became more frequent. Phone calls late at night. Short, raspy messages. Sometimes Ozzy wouldn't say much at all. Just a pause, a sigh, and a quiet, still going. Still here. Duvall believes Ozzy was afraid to fully come out and say it. To announce he wanted to retire, to rest, to live the remainder of his life in peace. Because doing so would not just be a career decision, it would be a betrayal to the machine built around him. A machine with bills to pay, employees to support, brands to satisfy. And Sharon, as the head of that machine, may have felt she had no choice but to keep it running. But Duvall doesn't buy that. You always have a choice, he said, especially when it's your husband. The tragedy of Ozzy Osbourne, according to Robert, isn't just that he was physically broken, it's that he was emotionally silenced. That in the moments when he needed compassion, he got contracts. When he needed a partner, he got a manager. When he asked to rest, he was told to perform. In the months before Ozzy disappeared from public view entirely, Duvall noticed a shift. The calls stopped. The invites ceased. There was radio silence. He heard rumors of health setbacks, of surgeries gone wrong, of doctors urging Sharon to reconsider future engagements. But none of it was confirmed. Everything was carefully managed, spun, and filtered through a lens of optimism. And then came the announcement. No more tours. No more shows. Ozzy was stepping back. But Duvall says that decision came far too late. The damage was already done. And what the public didn't know was that behind that statement was a man already diminished beyond recognition. He should have been off the stage years ago, Duvall says. Not because he didn't love music. He did. But because he was suffering. And everyone knew it. This chapter reveals the private agony behind the public performances. It's the part of the story most fans never saw. The quiet, desperate moments when Ozzy Osbourne stopped being a performer and became a prisoner. A man trapped not by fame, but by fear. Fear of letting people down. Fear of stopping. Fear of what would happen if he finally said no. And at the center of that fear was the one person who could have set him free. The next chapter takes us deeper into the financial machinery behind the scenes, how touring became not just a career, but a necessity. How every step Ozzy took, even the painful ones, fed an empire that refused to slow down. And how Sharon Osbourne allegedly kept that wheel spinning, no matter the cost. Money changes everything. That phrase has echoed across generations of artists, families, and empires. But when it comes to the Osbournes, Robert Duvall says it wasn't just money that changed everything. It was what people were willing to do for it. And more importantly, what they were willing to ignore. In this chapter, we delve into what Duvall believes to be the driving force behind the ongoing exploitation of Ozzy Osbourne during the twilight of his career. Not loyalty, not legacy, not even love. It was money. And not just money in the sense of income, but an entire ecosystem, a sprawling, high-stakes empire fueled by Ozzy's continued presence in the spotlight. An empire that, according to Duvall, Sharon Osbourne refused to let go of, even if it meant sacrificing her husband's health and dignity. To fully grasp the weight of what Duvall alleges, you have to look at the business model that surrounded Ozzy. He wasn't just a solo artist or an aging rock star performing for nostalgia's sake. Ozzy was a brand that extended across music, merchandise, television, appearances, product endorsements, and more. Millions of dollars flowed through that brand every year. And at the center of it all was Sharon, manager, executive, and decision-maker. What many fans never realized, Duvall claims, is that everything about Ozzy's later career was carefully monetized. Tour schedules weren't just about the music. They were part of a larger strategy tied to merchandise drops, brand partnerships, exclusive licensing deals, and investor expectations. If Ozzy didn't show up, the ripple effect impacted everything from t-shirt sales to distribution contracts. In that sense, every time Ozzy stepped on stage, he wasn't just performing. He was activating a complex financial machine. And that machine couldn't afford to stop. Duvall likens the situation to a circus elephant. You train it to perform. You paint it up, parade it around. And even when it gets old and tired, you keep it moving, because the show depends on it. He pauses, then adds, but the difference is, elephants don't have a choice. And neither did Ozzy. According to Duvall, Sharon was acutely aware of this machine. She understood every dollar, every contract clause, every potential pitfall. And while that level of management made her a powerhouse in the industry, it also made her dangerous. Especially when the lines between business and marriage began to blur. There were moments, Duvall says, when Ozzy tried to step back. He would cancel an appearance or ask to postpone a performance. Each time, Sharon would allegedly remind him of what was at stake. Not just for him, but for everyone. Their staff, their children's careers, their investors, their fans. The guilt, Duvall suggests, was weaponized. She'd say things like, "If you stop now, you're letting down everyone who believes in you," Duvall recalled. Or, "People are counting on you, Ozzy. Don't be selfish." Over time, Duvall believes, those reminders became more than just encouragement. They became chains. The financial commitments were immense. Between the costs of maintaining multiple homes, staff salaries, travel logistics, legal teams, and public relations firms, the Osbourne brand required a constant influx of capital. Even minor disruptions in the schedule could lead to significant losses. In that environment, the idea of Ozzy retiring wasn't just inconvenient, it was threatening. And so, according to Duvall, Sharon developed tactics. Subtle, quiet tactics that kept Ozzy moving forward even as his body broke down. She would allegedly time announcements for tours when he was having good health days, locking him into contracts while he was optimistic. She would downplay the severity of his symptoms to agents and executives. She would encourage media narratives that framed Ozzy's continued touring as noble and heroic, when in reality, it was, Duvall says, an act of survival. One of the more chilling stories Duvall recounts involved a major European tour deal worth tens of millions. The contract required Ozzy to appear in at least 85% of the scheduled performances. Failure to meet that threshold would result in massive penalties, not just financial, but reputational. When Ozzy expressed doubt, worried about his stamina and physical limitations, Sharon allegedly arranged for a private consultation with a doctor known for giving favorable evaluations. The doctor cleared him, and the tour was announced shortly after. It wasn't about whether he could do it safely, Duvall says. It was about whether she could get a signature on that contract. Other tactics were less overt. Duvall says Sharon surrounded Ozzy with yes-men, handlers, assistants, and medical staff who were more loyal to her than to him. They maintained a carefully curated reality, one in which Ozzy was always just well enough, just strong enough, to keep going. Dissent was discouraged. Sympathy was seen as sabotage. In one instance, a longtime staff member reportedly confronted Sharon about Ozzy's condition, begging her to reconsider the upcoming tour schedule. Within weeks, that person was let go. The message was clear: fall in line or fall out of favor. To the public, none of this was visible. Sharon appeared at events smiling, defending Ozzy, insisting he was doing what he loved. And perhaps, in her mind, that was true. Perhaps she believed that keeping him on stage was keeping him alive, that without the music, Ozzy would fade faster. But Duvall argues that intention doesn't erase impact. She may have thought she was saving him, Duvall says. But sometimes the thing you think is saving someone is the thing killing them. The financial benefits of keeping Ozzy active were staggering. Tour profits, merchandise sales, increased streaming royalties, television licensing. Each new performance reinvigorated the brand. Ozzy wasn't just a man anymore. He was a product line, a legacy investment. And like all investments, the goal was maximum return. Duvall describes a moment where Ozzy, barely able to walk without assistance, was asked to record a promotional video for an upcoming tour. He stumbled through the lines, his speech slurred, his eyes glazed. After several takes, he looked directly into the camera and whispered, "I can't do this." The footage was never released, but the tour went on anyway. Stories like these are hard to hear because they challenge everything fans want to believe. We like to imagine our heroes on their own terms, fighting, surviving, and choosing their path. But if Duvall's account is accurate, Ozzy's final years weren't about choice. They were about obligation. Obligation wrapped in the guise of opportunity. And that obligation, Duvall believes, was enforced not by the music industry, not by record labels or agents, but by his wife. The one person who should have been able to say, "Enough." This chapter reveals a pattern, one where financial necessity was used to justify physical and emotional exploitation, where business goals eclipsed basic human decency, where a man's cries for help were muffled by the sound of counting money. As Duvall speaks, his frustration is palpable. He doesn't raise his voice, but his hands clench. His voice drops. It wasn't just that she kept him working. It was that she made him feel like he had no other choice. That if he stopped, he was letting down the world. That kind of pressure can break even the strongest person. And Ozzy, he was already broken. In the next chapter, we'll look deeper into a night that would forever haunt Duvall and others close to Ozzy. A night when the rock legend collapsed backstage, his body finally reaching its limit. A night that should have marked the end, but instead became just another show. There are moments that divide a life into two parts, before and after. For those closest to Ozzy Osbourne, one such moment came on a night cloaked in confusion, fear, and a silence that Robert Duvall says was deliberately imposed. It happened during the European leg of what many called Ozzy's final great tour, a series of shows meant to celebrate his decades-long career. But instead of a victory lap, it nearly became a death sentence. The performance was in Germany. A packed arena, flashing lights, and an audience roaring with anticipation. From the outside, it was a typical night in the world of rock and roll. But for Ozzy, it was the culmination of days of mounting pain, medication adjustments, and a body that had been giving increasingly louder warning signs. According to Duvall, who wasn't there that night, but spoke directly with multiple members of the tour crew afterward, Ozzy had been feeling off for days. Not just tired, but unsteady, dizzy. His legs buckled without warning. His vision blurred. He was unable to complete full sentences without shortness of breath. The crew noticed. The doctor assigned to the tour noticed. Even Ozzy himself reportedly said, "I don't think I should go on tonight." But he did. Why? Duvall says the pressure was unbearable. A sold-out show. A live-streaming contract already signed. A lineup of lucrative merchandise sales tied to the performance. Backing out would trigger not just fan disappointment, but a wave of financial penalties. So Ozzy, as he had always done, put on the armor of the Prince of Darkness and walked into the lights. The performance started shaky. Those in the crowd thought maybe Ozzy was just a little off that night. He missed cues, struggled to stay upright, and forgot several lyrics. But he powered through. The stage team made subtle adjustments on the fly, turning down his mic when his voice wavered, timing smoke machines to distract from his stumbles. On the surface, the illusion held. But backstage, panic was brewing. According to a senior staffer who spoke anonymously, Ozzy collapsed just 15 minutes before the end of the set. Not a stumble, not a dramatic flare, a full collapse. He was carried off stage by two handlers as the band continued playing, the lighting crew frantically adjusting spotlights to hide the chaos. A pre-recorded segment was quickly cued to buy time. What happened next, Duvall says, was where the real tragedy began. Instead of canceling the remainder of the performance, a team of medics was brought in. Ozzy, semi-conscious and disoriented, was stabilized in a dressing room backstage. Fluids were administered. Oxygen provided. One source claimed he was given a small dose of a stimulant, just enough to regain composure. Then, after less than 30 minutes of recovery, Sharon herself allegedly entered the room and said words that Duvall later heard repeated by several sources. "Can you stand?" Then we finished the show. And he did. He returned to the stage, visibly weaker, leaning on a microphone stand for balance. His voice cracked with every word, but the crowd roared in admiration, thinking they were witnessing a triumph of resilience. They didn't know they were witnessing a man held together by tape and willpower. Duvall says that night changed Ozzy. It wasn't just that he collapsed. It was that no one treated it like a stop sign. They treated it like a speed bump. After the show, Ozzy reportedly slept for nearly 20 hours straight. He missed press calls and private events. Still, within 2 days, he was flown to the next city for another performance. When a crew member questioned whether they should cancel the rest of the tour, they were allegedly told, "The train doesn't stop now. We're almost through." The financial implications of canceling were immense. Insurance policies tied to completed performances, bonuses for full tour completion, record label agreements requiring a minimum number of public appearances. Every element was designed to keep the machine moving, regardless of the human cost. But this collapse wasn't just a warning shot. It was a cry for help. A moment where Ozzy's body screamed what his mouth couldn't. And yet, it was brushed aside in favor of the next show, the next check, the next opportunity. Robert Duvall was furious when he found out. A member of the crew called him the next morning and described the entire ordeal in hushed tones, fearing retaliation. Duvall's reaction was immediate. I said, "That's it. This has gone too far." But when I tried to get through to Sharon, she brushed me off. Said it wasn't as bad as people were making it out to be. Said he was fine. But Duvall didn't believe that. He had seen the look in Ozzy's eyes too many times. He knew what was behind the foggy stare, the slurred speech, the hunched shoulders. He knew what it looked like when someone was being pushed beyond their limits. What bothered him even more was how quickly the incident was covered up. The footage from that night was never released. Photos of the collapse disappeared. Media reports praised Ozzy for another epic performance. There was no mention of what happened backstage. No hint that one of rock's greatest icons had been moments away from complete physical failure. It was, as Duvall puts it, a masterclass in crisis management. They buried it. Completely. And in doing so, they buried the man. In the days that followed, Ozzy's communications became sporadic. Duvall tried to reach him repeatedly, only to be met with vague text messages or silence. When he finally got through, Ozzy sounded distant, almost robotic. "I'm fine, Bob. Everything's good." But Duvall didn't buy it. Behind those words, he heard something else. Defeat. Exhaustion. Fear. He remembers the last meaningful conversation they had. Ozzy was in a hotel room, recovering between shows. He spoke slowly, pausing often to catch his breath. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," he told Duvall. "I'm watching myself from the outside, doing things I don't want to do." That night in Germany, to Duvall, was the tipping point. It marked the moment when Ozzy's autonomy vanished completely. When his body said no, but the world said yes. When the man who once defined rebellion became a prisoner to the very system he once raged against. The collapse wasn't the end of the tour. It wasn't even a disruption. It was just another moment swept under the rug, another sacrifice made in the name of brand continuity. And that, Duvall says, is what broke him. He couldn't sleep for days after hearing the details. He replayed that phone call over and over. And with each retelling, his guilt grew. Guilt for not speaking out sooner. For not pushing harder. For letting the machine roll on while one of its most essential parts was falling apart. It was like watching a friend drown, Duvall said quietly. And everyone standing around clapping, thinking he was swimming. As the tour continued, more incidents followed. Minor falls, unexplained illnesses, increasing dependence on backstage medical support. Yet the public never knew. Photos were carefully chosen. Statements were polished. The illusion remained intact. But the man behind it all was fading. This chapter isn't just about a single night. It's about what that night revealed. A complete disconnection between Ozzy's reality and the narrative being presented to the world. A moment when everything should have stopped, but instead, sped up. The collapse nobody was supposed to see wasn't just a physical fall. It was symbolic. A representation of everything Duvall had feared for years. That Ozzy Osbourne, one of the most iconic figures in music history, had become something less than human in the eyes of those profiting from him. In the next chapter, we'll go even deeper into the world of medical reports, diagnoses, and the people who allegedly kept critical information hidden. Because if what Duvall says is true, Ozzy's collapse wasn't the first warning, and it wouldn't be the last. In the world of celebrity and entertainment, image is everything. The story matters more than the facts, and perception often outweighs truth. But when it comes to health, when a human body is breaking down, no amount of branding can erase reality. Robert Duvall says the truth about Ozzy Osbourne's medical condition was known long before the public got a glimpse of it. And worse, it was systematically hidden, downplayed, and manipulated to keep the show going. What began as private concern slowly turned into a public lie, one that allowed a man's body to be pushed past its limits, all under the spotlight. Ozzy's health issues were no secret by the time the world started to see the visible signs. The trembling hands, the slowed speech, the labored walking. These were symptoms of a man fighting a brutal internal battle. But the reality, according to multiple sources close to the family and confirmed by Duvall's direct conversations with Ozzy, was even worse behind closed doors. In 2003, Ozzy was diagnosed with a hereditary form of Parkinson's disease, Parkin. Unlike typical Parkinson's, Parkin can present earlier in life, with muscle stiffness, tremors, and difficulty in movement. For years, the diagnosis was kept private. It wasn't until much later, in 2020, that the public was finally told the truth. But by then, Duvall claims, the disease had already progressed to a dangerous point. And yet, somehow, the tours continued. Duvall remembers a conversation he had with Ozzy just a few months after the official announcement. Ozzy was on painkillers, still recovering from a recent spinal surgery, and trying to keep his spirits up. "They're saying I might be able to walk on my own again," he told Duvall. "But even if I don't, they're working on stage setups. I won't need to move much." It was a moment that struck Duvall deeply, not because Ozzy was hopeful, but because he had already resigned himself to continuing, regardless of whether he could physically handle it. Instead of prioritizing rest or long-term care, the focus had shifted to how to make the performance possible, even with major mobility issues. By this point, Ozzy's medical chart read like a tragedy in slow motion. Parkinson's, multiple back surgeries, a severe staph infection, a neck injury, flu complications, chronic pain, and perhaps most worrying of all, what some insiders referred to as persistent neurological episodes. Short spells of confusion and disorientation that could leave him unable to communicate clearly. Several doctors allegedly advised against further touring. They cited the cumulative toll of travel, long performances, stress, and disrupted sleep cycles. These weren't suggestions, they were warnings. But according to Duvall, those warnings were either ignored or minimized by Sharon and the management team around her. There was one incident in particular that still haunts Duvall. He heard it from a nurse who had worked with Ozzy during the preparation for a North American tour. The nurse, who requested anonymity, said Ozzy had suffered what she believed was a mild stroke during rehearsals. It lasted less than a minute. No paralysis, but temporary speech, slurring, and unresponsiveness. When she raised the alarm, she was reportedly told not to report it and was let go a week later. Duvall says this was just one of many red flags swept under the rug. "They created a system where the truth became inconvenient," he said. If a doctor said Ozzy wasn't fit to tour, they found another doctor. If a nurse spoke out, she disappeared. It was always the same answer: "He wants this. He's okay." The reality, however, was anything but okay. Ozzy's hands had become so unstable that he could no longer sign autographs. His gait was uneven, often requiring a handler or cane to walk. His memory was becoming patchy. Friends and crew began to notice him repeating himself or forgetting key details. And still, he was booked for shows, interviews, and recordings. To maintain the illusion, several tactics were allegedly used. Interview questions were pre-approved. Editing teams trimmed footage to remove signs of confusion or hesitation. Promotional photos were staged with Ozzy sitting or leaning, using strategic lighting and angles to hide physical decline. Even public appearances were carefully choreographed. Short, timed to the minute, with assistants just out of frame ready to intervene. But Duvall insists that the worst part wasn't the cover-up. It was watching Ozzy internalize it all. He began to believe that if he stopped, the world would stop with him. That without him, the empire would collapse. That even in his failing state, he had to keep going. He was told, over and over again, that this was what he wanted, that he was doing it for the fans, for the family, for the brand. There's a psychological burden in being treated as more valuable sick and working than healthy and retired. Duvall believes Ozzy began to view himself not as a person with a right to rest, but as a vessel for other people's expectations. His self-worth was tied to his ability to perform, and that need was carefully fed by those around him. The turning point, Duvall says, came when Ozzy stopped asking questions. He stopped pushing back, stopped talking about his pain. He simply nodded when told the schedule, smiled when told the cameras were on, recited the same phrases during interviews. "I'm doing great. Can't wait to get back on the road." But Duvall knew those weren't Ozzy's words. They were scripts. Scripts designed to hold the narrative together. It's not unusual for celebrities to perform through pain. Many do. But what sets Ozzy's case apart, according to those like Duvall, is the scale and intentionality of the manipulation. This wasn't a one-time push. It was a sustained campaign, Years of decisions made not in service to the man, but to the machine. And every time Ozzy's body screamed for rest, the machine found a way to silence it. One doctor who consulted on Ozzy's care, and who requested anonymity due to ongoing legal constraints, said bluntly, "He should have been on full medical leave years ago. Touring, at his level of decline, was medically dangerous. But my advice didn't go far." Fans started to notice, too. Online forums began buzzing with concern. Videos of Ozzy's interviews raised eyebrows. Some fans worried aloud about elder abuse, questioning how much control Ozzy really had over his life. But the official narrative always remained upbeat, carefully crafted. Ozzy's a fighter. He's not done yet. Duvall doesn't fault fans for buying into that story. They love him, he said. They wanted to believe he was okay, that he was happy. But love can blind you. It can make you ignore what's right in front of your face. He believes that what Ozzy needed most in those years wasn't applause. It was honesty, space, peace, time to heal, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And instead, what he got was a stage, a spotlight, and a script he couldn't walk away from. In the end, the medical red flags were everywhere. The tremors, the fatigue, the neurological complications, the constant pain. And yet, the show went on. Because behind every diagnosis, there was a dollar sign. Behind every warning, a workaround. This chapter peels back the last illusion. The idea that Ozzy was in control, that he was making his own choices, that he was living out his dream. Duvall believes the truth is much harder to swallow. That Ozzy Osbourne, the indomitable Prince of Darkness, spent the final years of his public life being carefully guided through a maze of manipulation, his medical needs secondary to the needs of an empire built on his name. In the next chapter, we'll examine how that empire was legally constructed and the ironclad contracts that kept Ozzy locked into obligations he couldn't escape. It's one thing to be physically unwell. It's another thing entirely to be financially trapped in your own body. In the entertainment industry, contracts are everything. They dictate schedules, ownership, profit sharing, and obligations that can extend years, even decades, into the future. But while most celebrities negotiate these agreements with powerful lawyers and calculated foresight, Robert Duvall says that Ozzy Osbourne was often pulled into contracts not with caution or understanding, but with exhaustion, emotional pressure, and blind trust in the very people who, according to Duvall, were orchestrating his slow downfall. To understand how Ozzy came to be locked into an unrelenting cycle of performance despite serious health decline, we must peel back the legal architecture that was quietly built around him over the years. Duvall paints a picture of a man who was increasingly isolated from decision-making, whose signature became more valuable than his voice, and who, over time, found himself bound by contracts so aggressive they essentially eliminated his ability to say no. It began subtly. In the early 2000s, when Sharon was at the height of her managerial influence, the contracts tied to Ozzy's appearances grew more ambitious. Not only did they require performance dates, but they also included obligations for media appearances, brand endorsements, exclusive interviews, and reality content. Each new deal bundled more components together, stacking layers of expectation on Ozzy's shoulders. Duvall recalls one such deal, a multi-country tour package signed in the mid-2010s. It included not just concerts but full backstage access for a docuseries, coordinated brand tie-ins with high-end fashion labels, and live meet-and-greets with fans in multiple countries. The fine print revealed strict cancellation penalties. If even one show was missed without medical exemption from an approved physician, the Osbournes would face millions in penalties and partial forfeiture of earnings. The term approved physician may sound standard, but Duvall alleges that this was a calculated control measure. The medical professionals tied to Ozzy's contracts were, in many cases, handpicked by management, often ensuring favorable evaluations. "You want to cancel a show?" Duvall said. "Then you better hope the doctor agrees. And when that doctor's paycheck depends on the tour going forward, guess what happens?" This is where the line between care and coercion blurred. According to Duvall, there were moments when Ozzy clearly didn't want to continue, but the contracts he had signed gave him little choice. Canceling meant not just breaking the deal. It meant damaging relationships with sponsors, networks, and tour organizers who had already invested millions based on his commitment. Duvall tells the story of a late-night call from Ozzy, just weeks before the start of what was billed as his farewell tour. Ozzy's voice was hoarse. He was slurring slightly. "I didn't even know I signed it," he said. "She told me it was standard stuff, just paperwork. Now I'm locked in again." That particular contract, according to insiders, included over 60 performances across 3 continents. It required promotional appearances before and after the tour, as well as public engagements with brands that were tied to the event. Ozzy's image was also licensed to third-party vendors for merchandise, meaning every appearance fed a larger commercial engine that kept the Osbourne empire afloat. And the exit clause? Virtually non-existent. Unless Ozzy suffered a catastrophic, documented medical event certified by independent examiners, he was expected to show up or pay the price. The language of these contracts was precise and harsh. One clause reportedly stated, "Performers' failure to attend more than 3 sequential scheduled appearances will constitute a breach of agreement and result in full forfeiture of compensation." Another noted, "The performer agrees to maintain a physical appearance consistent with the public brand image established under the Osbourne family licensing agreement." In simpler terms, if he stopped showing up, or if he looked too sick to represent the brand, he could be replaced, or worse, cut out of the earnings he'd already secured. For Duvall, these contracts were more than legal documents. They were shackles. They weren't written to protect Ozzy, he said. They were written to protect the people making money off of him. And they worked. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of how Ozzy was presented with these contracts. Multiple sources claim that in his later years, he was frequently asked to sign documents during periods of heavy medication or exhaustion. Meetings were scheduled after performances, during recovery treatments, or on days when Ozzy's mental clarity was visibly diminished. One tour assistant, who has since left the industry, described the process in detail. "They'd bring the papers, tell him what they were, and Sharon would say, 'It's all routine, love. Just sign so we can move on.' He didn't ask questions. He trusted her. Sometimes I don't think he even knew what year it was." This level of manipulation, if true, isn't just unethical. It flirts dangerously with elder abuse. Legal experts contacted anonymously for commentary described the situation as a textbook red flag, especially if Ozzy was under the influence of painkillers, anti-anxiety medication, or Parkinson's treatment during key decision-making moments. Duvall believes there were people in Ozzy's inner circle who saw what was happening but chose to remain silent. Why? Because the system was lucrative. Ozzy's tours generated revenue for dozens, possibly hundreds, of individuals and companies. From roadies to PR firms to licensing partners, his continued activity meant continued paychecks. To disrupt that system would have been to dismantle an entire economy built around one man's suffering. The contracts were designed to eliminate unpredictability, to convert the chaotic spirit of a rock legend into a dependable business model. And they succeeded. Every move Ozzy made, every word he spoke in public, every handshake, photo op, and social media post was scheduled, monitored, and monetized. But as Duvall points out, what happens when the performer no longer wants to perform? What happens when a man's signature becomes more important than his voice? The tragedy, he says, isn't just that Ozzy was bound by these agreements. It's that he was bound by them with no clear exit. That even when his health collapsed, when his doctors warned against further travel, when he himself said he was done, there was always another loophole, another obligation, another financial incentive to keep going just a little longer. Duvall likens it to being locked in a room with a treadmill that never stops. Even when you can't run anymore, the belt keeps moving. You stumble. You fall. And instead of someone hitting the emergency stop, they just yell at you to get back up. There's a particularly heartbreaking moment Duvall recalls, a phone call in which Ozzy, fighting tears, asked a simple question. "Bob, can someone stop a contract if they're too sick?" The answer, legally, is yes. But the real-world application, especially in a web of interconnected obligations and aggressive business managers, is far murkier. This chapter reveals a truth more sobering than any headline. Ozzy Osbourne, the wild man of rock, the rebel who spat in the face of conformity, had become a man boxed in by legal commitments he barely understood. And the worst part, Duvall insists, is that those contracts didn't just dictate his schedule, they dictated his life, his rest, his privacy. his health, his ability to choose when and how to step away. In the next chapter, we'll turn away from paperwork and into the deeply human story of love, loyalty, and blurred boundaries. Because as Duvall reminds us, behind every signed deal was a relationship, and at the center of it all was Sharon Osbourne, a wife, a manager, and, according to Duvall, the person who ultimately held the power to free him, but never did. On the surface, Ozzy and Sharon Osbourne appeared to have one of the most enduring marriages in the entertainment industry. Decades together, children raised, empires built, public ups and downs, reconciliations played out on television screens across the world. They were the rare power couple who didn't pretend to be perfect, which made them relatable to millions. But behind the public declarations of love and loyalty, Robert Duvall suggests something else was happening, something much more troubling. A relationship where the lines between affection and authority, devotion and dominance, became dangerously blurred. For many, Sharon was Ozzy's savior. In his darkest moments, she pulled him out of drug addiction, secured his solo career after his exit from Black Sabbath, and managed to rebuild his name and fortune when he was at rock bottom. Without her, there's a strong argument to be made that Ozzy's career, and maybe his life, might not have survived the 1980s. That's not speculation, it's historical fact. But Duvall urges us to consider what happens when a rescuer becomes a ruler. When the person who once saved you uses that act as the foundation of complete control. As he puts it, there's a difference between being helped and being owned. And I think somewhere along the way, Ozzy stopped being helped and started being handled. Their relationship, while filled with undeniable love at times, was also deeply transactional. Sharon wasn't just Ozzy's wife, she was his manager, his spokesperson, his image curator. And over the years, those roles often clashed. Duvall recalls moments where Ozzy would express deep personal pain, only to be met with scheduling updates. I remember hearing her say, "You can rest after the tour, darling. Just a few more weeks." She said it like it was a loving encouragement, but it wasn't. It was a command wrapped in comfort. Duvall believes that Sharon's love for Ozzy became entangled with her investment in the brand, and that the deeper that brand grew into a global force, the harder it became for her to distinguish between the man she married and the product she managed. There were early signs. One of the most telling was how Sharon responded to Ozzy's health crises. When Ozzy was hospitalized after a staph infection, Duvall says he was shocked to learn that within 24 hours of surgery, the team was already discussing how to reschedule his appearances to avoid financial losses. The man had an four in his arm, Duvall said. He was barely coherent. And the conversation was about image control. To some, this is simply the harsh reality of the entertainment business. But Duvall sees it as something darker, a pattern where Sharon's first priority was always the show, not the man behind it. Even Ozzy, in rare vulnerable moments, hinted at feeling lost in his own life. "Sometimes I think she sees me as a business," he once told Duvall. "Not a husband, not a father, just the show." Their marriage was tested publicly many times. Infidelity, separations, reconciliations, public fights, and emotional interviews were all part of their history. But even in the most turbulent times, Sharon retained her position of control. She was the manager, the voice of reason, the architect, and Ozzy, no matter how famous, remained the product. One particularly emotional episode unfolded during the filming of their reality show. Ozzy was visibly in pain, struggling with mobility, and clearly out of sync. Instead of adjusting filming schedules or halting production, the crew was allegedly instructed to keep rolling and get what we can. Sharon, according to a producer who worked on the show, gave clear directions not to let Ozzy appear weak. If he starts slurring, she reportedly said, "Cut around it. We're not showing him like that." Duvall doesn't blame her entirely. He acknowledges the pressure she must have felt to keep everything afloat, to protect their financial future, to fulfill obligations, to maintain a legacy. But he also believes that Sharon's inability to step back and see Ozzy as a human being first and foremost contributed significantly to his decline. One of the hardest things for Duvall to process, he says, was the loneliness he saw in Ozzy's eyes. This was a man surrounded by people, adored by millions, but somehow utterly alone. Because the one person who should have said, "Let's stop, let's rest, let's live out the rest of our lives in peace," she didn't. She kept saying, What's next? It raises a haunting question. Can love and control coexist? Can a person simultaneously love someone deeply and also push them beyond the brink? For Duvall, the answer is complicated. He believes Sharon did love Ozzy, but her love was tangled in her ambition, her identity, and her fear of losing control. I don't think she saw it as cruelty, he said. I think she thought she was doing what was best, that she was holding it all together. But that's the danger of power. You start thinking you know better than the person you're controlling. There were times when Ozzy attempted to assert himself, moments where he said no, where he pushed back. But each time, Duvall says, there were consequences. An argument, a guilt trip, a cold shoulder. The warmth disappeared until Ozzy fell back in line. He once told me, Duvall recalled, that silence was worse than yelling. When Sharon got quiet, he knew he had disappointed her. And that, more than anything, tore him apart. Because all he wanted was for her to be proud of him. This psychological manipulation wasn't loud. It wasn't abusive in the traditional sense. It was subtle, soft-spoken, but it was there. In every decision Ozzy didn't make. In every performance he didn't want to give. In every night he spent recovering from a show he didn't have to do. Their love story is often held up as a symbol of resilience. And in many ways, it was. They survived scandals, illness, addiction, and fame. But survival doesn't always mean health. Sometimes it means enduring something that slowly chips away at your soul. Robert Duvall doesn't claim to know everything that happened behind closed doors. But he knows what he saw. He knows what he heard. And he knows that somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. Ozzy stopped being a man in love and started being a man leveraged by it. In the next chapter, we'll explore the silence from those who knew better. The crew members, the friends, the industry insiders who saw what was happening and chose to look away. Because no system like this survives without complicity. And Ozzy, Duvall says, was surrounded by enablers who cashed in on his suffering and stayed silent while he faded. In the aftermath of every fallen star, there are always whispers. People who claim they knew something was wrong. People who say they saw the signs but didn't know what to do. In Ozzy Osbourne's case, Robert Duvall insists those whispers were louder than anyone cares to admit. And the silence that followed them wasn't born from ignorance. It was rooted in fear, profit, and self-preservation. By the time Ozzy's health began visibly declining, his entourage had grown into an industrial-sized support system. There were doctors, assistants, publicists, tour managers, legal teams, personal chefs, therapists, physical trainers, stylists, production crews, and security. Dozens of people moved around him daily. Some had worked with him for decades. Others were newer, brought in as his needs shifted. But all of them were part of what Duvall calls the machine. The machine was bigger than Ozzy. It included record labels, streaming platforms, sponsorship agencies, documentary producers, fashion partners, and event organizers. And every piece of that machine relied on one thing: Ozzy's continued public presence. If Ozzy stopped, the machine stopped. And when that kind of money is on the line, people will convince themselves of almost anything. Duvall believes this was the primary reason no one spoke up. They weren't blind. They weren't dumb. They knew. But they were afraid of losing their place. Their job. Their access. Their check. He shakes his head slowly. You'd be surprised how many people will step over a man if he's the road to their fortune. According to several insiders Duvall says he's spoken to over the years, there were many moments when someone tried to speak up. A production assistant who questioned Ozzy's condition during a filming session was allegedly reassigned. A tour medic who raised concerns about Ozzy's ability to travel was quietly replaced. A choreographer who suggested scaling down the performances was met with sharp resistance and later let go. The pattern was consistent. Challenge the plan, and you're removed from it. One former tour manager, who worked with the Osbourne team during a major international run, recounted an incident where Ozzy nearly collapsed before stepping on stage. He was white as a sheet, sweating, could barely stand. I said, "Let's cancel tonight. We can reschedule." Sharon looked at me and said, "Do that and you'll be replaced by morning." The show went on. Another crew member told Duvall that they used to joke, grimly, about having an ambulance always idling near the stage exit. Not for emergencies, the crew member said. For inevitabilities. This culture of silence wasn't passive. It was enforced. There was a strict hierarchy, and Sharon sat at the top. Anyone who wanted access to Ozzy, anyone who wanted to stay employed, had to go through her. She was the gatekeeper, and she didn't tolerate interference. Duvall describes it as a kind of quiet authoritarianism. She didn't need to scream. All she had to do was raise an eyebrow, and people fell in line. This created an atmosphere of compliance. Even those who deeply cared about Ozzy, who wanted to help, felt powerless. One close friend of the family told Duvall, "You learn quickly. You either stay quiet or you disappear." What's particularly painful for Duvall is how many people he knew personally who could have intervened but didn't. Fellow musicians, producers, agents, people who had seen Ozzy at his best and his worst, and who understood what was happening. Some were lifelong friends. Others had been on tour with him, seen him backstage in his weakest moments. And yet, they said nothing. Fear makes cowards of us all, Duvall says. But in this case, it also made accomplices. He recounts a conversation with a longtime sound engineer who admitted he knew Ozzy wasn't well enough to perform during a 2019 show. He couldn't even finish a full sentence during the soundcheck. And we still ran the show. I hated myself that night. But I had a mortgage, a family. That excuse, financial need, is one Duvall heard over and over again. And while he doesn't dismiss it, he also doesn't let it off the hook. I get it, he says. People need to work. But at what cost? When does your paycheck stop being worth someone else's suffering? There was also the problem of normalization. Over time, Ozzy's condition became just how he is. The slurred speech, the forgetfulness, the slow movements. These became part of the expected routine. Staff and fans alike adjusted their expectations, thinking, that's just Ozzy now. But Duvall says this normalization was incredibly dangerous. When decline becomes routine, abuse hides in plain sight. Some who remained close to the situation claim that speaking up wasn't just discouraged, it was punished. One journalist who attempted to write a behind-the-scenes piece on Ozzy's declining health says she was blacklisted by multiple publicists. She had been given access to a few tour stops, but was abruptly cut off after asking questions about Ozzy's medication regimen. The message was clear, she said. Tell the story we want, or don't tell it at all. This level of control extended to the fans as well. Online communities were monitored, and criticisms were often dismissed as conspiracies or jealousy. Anyone who questioned whether Ozzy should still be touring was shouted down by superfans who believed they were defending his legacy. But in reality, they were defending an illusion. Duvall is careful not to paint all silence with the same brush. He acknowledges that some people were genuinely afraid. Afraid of lawsuits. Afraid of being cut off. Afraid of damaging a man's reputation they genuinely admired. It's not always about greed, he says. Sometimes it's about not knowing how to help. About feeling like the problem is too big to fix. But ultimately, he believes that if more people had spoken out, louder, sooner, with unity, things might have been different. Maybe Ozzy wouldn't have collapsed on tour. Maybe he wouldn't have been bound by suffocating contracts. Maybe he would have found peace sooner. The truth, Duvall says, is that silence protected the system. And that system, designed to keep the Ozzy Osbourne brand alive, slowly drained the man behind it. This chapter lays bare the complicity that surrounded Ozzy in his final active years. It wasn't just Sharon. It was a network of people from every level of the industry who chose self-preservation over intervention. People who might have loved him, might have admired him, but ultimately remained quiet while he struggled. In the next chapter, we'll look at the moment everything broke. The final tour, the final shows, the breakdown that even the machine couldn't cover up, and the words Ozzy said when he finally realized he couldn't go on any longer.